Tonight we're going to be looking at a certain rich man who thought he had it made. Wayne said he liked that title. A certain rich man that thought he had it made in Luke chapter 12. Let's begin with verse 13 and we'll read through verse 21. I want you to see the full story and the reason behind it before we begin to make our comments. I think tonight's lesson will certainly bless each one of us, but it's going to help us to keep our attention on the important things in life. So, beginning in verse 13 of Luke chapter 12, Luke said, "And one of the company said unto him, Master, speak to my brother, that he divide the inheritance with me. And he said unto him, Man, who made me a judge or a divider over you? And he said unto them, Take heed and beware of covetousness. For a man's life consisteth not in the abundance of the things which he possesseth. And he spake a parable unto them, saying, The ground of a certain rich man brought forth plentifully. And he thought within himself, saying, What shall I do? Because I have no room where to bestow my fruits. And he said, This will I do. I will pull down my barns and build greater, and there will I bestow all my fruits and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, thou hast much goods laid up for many years. Take thine ease, eat, drink, and be merry. And God said unto him, Thou fool, this night thy soul shall be required of thee. Then whose shall these things be, which thou hast provided? So is he that layeth up treasure for himself, and is not rich toward God." Now, it's not unusual to find somebody coming to Jesus wanting something, asking for something, wanting Jesus to do something. But on this occasion, we find a brother approaching Jesus and asking him to settle a dispute that he was having with his other brother about the family will. The law, if you read the book of Numbers and Deuteronomy, the law dictated that gave specific instructions concerning the division of an inheritance. But apparently these brothers, in spite of the instructions which God had already given in Numbers and Deuteronomy, these brothers were just not satisfied with the way things were being divided. You see, rabbis, and Jesus was considered a rabbi or a teacher, rabbis many times took care of these things when these matters came up to help divide the inheritances. And so these brothers, this brother that came to the Lord probably thought, well, I'll get Jesus to take care of the problem. So the answer that he got from Jesus was not exactly what he thought he might get. Take a look at verse 14. Jesus said to him, Man, who made me a judge or a divider over you? In other words, he's saying, I'm not your arbitrator in this case. That's not why I'm here. As somebody suggested, Jesus was telling him that his mission in life, the whole reason why he came, was more important than disputing wills. What he had to do and why he came was more important than just to help in a family dispute. So he hadn't come to solve problems. He hadn't come to dispute legal matters. He came to save people. And so we find here in verse 15, the very next verse, that Jesus went on to say, Take heed and beware of covetousness. Pay attention now to yourself. Be careful. Watch out, because covetousness is a dangerous thing. He said, A man's life consisteth not of the abundance of the things which he possesses. So Jesus saw through this man's motives, and he warned him about greed and about covetousness. Now, what does the word covetousness mean? Covetous or covetousness describes the thirst for having more, and always having more and more and more and still more, never satisfied. That's covetousness. The Romans had a proverb, a saying that they used to say all the time. They used to say, money is like seawater. The more a man drinks, the thirstier he becomes. So the words of Jesus seem to suggest that the dispute between the brothers that they were having was because this brother that brought it before the Lord, this brother wanted more than he was given. I've been with families during these disputes and during times of funerals, which car they're going to ride in, a number of things. Many times you find a great deal of disputes when one person in a family doesn't feel that they're getting their just dues. Perhaps that's what was true here. Of course, all he said was powerful, but this particular statement touches the very core of life, the very core of the problem. He said in verse 15, a man's life consisteth not in the abundance of the things which he possesses. You know, there's a saying, and I'm sure y'all do it down here in Georgia. I knew I heard it up in Virginia growing up. Let me see if I can remember. It goes, the man with the most toys when he dies wins. And so many times we have that desire to have more. We got a car, we want a better car. We got a camper, we want a bigger camper. We got a home, we want a better home. I've counseled with a lot of young couples who are working 2 and 3 jobs to pay for a $500,000 home and 2 or 3 $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 automobiles. They weren't seeing each other, and so divorce was the only way they could make things right. So many times covetousness is the one problem that even Christians get involved in. Jesus was saying to this young man, life is more than wealth, life is more than things, life is more than possessions. You know, the older I'm getting, the better I understand that, the more it becomes real, because I'm finding that that's not what life is all about. I remember when my grandfather passed away, every year we always gave him, and all the family, there were 40-some of all of them, they always gave him work pants, and they gave him shirts and socks and all of that. And when he died, we started moving his bedroom around to get the stuff out. There were the boxes of Christmas gifts with the shirts and the pants. He wore the same shirts and the same pants for years. And he was satisfied with what he had when he got up into his 80s. So many times we're not. There are many people that are rich and yet they're poor. They have an extravagant house, but they have an empty heart. They have a tremendous salary, but they have a thirsty soul. They have the possessions, but they don't have any peace. They have much land, but they have a miserable life. And as Jesus said, life isn't in the abundance of the things which you own. It's not in the things, life itself doesn't find its fulfillment in the possessions that you have. You can have all that this world has to offer and still be poor in heart and poor in soul. I was reading the story about 3 ladies that were on a train a long time ago. They were going from Kansas City to Chicago during World War II. An evangelist's wife was sitting next to 2 other ladies. And one of the giddy young blonde women that were there had a filthy vocabulary as they sat together. Her words were filthy, and she had a little small bottle of whiskey in her coat pocket. The other woman that was there was a well-dressed lady of culture, refinement, whose husband was a very prominent businessman. And the third woman that was in this group along this trip was the wife of a preacher. So the 3 women talked very freely on the long trip. And the giddy young blonde offered them a drink, but they refused. And she told them how she was going to Chicago to spend the weekend with a soldier and how she lived for pleasure. She commented on the distinguished ladies' jewelry and minks that the woman had on. And the evangelist's wife talked to her about life with a preacher and how happy she was to be a Christian and be part of the Lord. Now, after a while, the well-dressed woman finally said to this young blonde, she said, "My dear, you say you would be happiest, you'd be a happier woman in the world if only you had my rings, my minks, my home, my money. I have these, and I have a great many, many other things that you don't know about. But instead of being happy, I believe I am the most unhappy woman in the world. I have wealth, I have a large home, I have servants, I have expensive things, but for years I've not been happy." I run into people like that all the time. They got everything that you think would make anybody happy, but they're not happy. Their home life is not happy. Their children are not happy. So I repeat, life doesn't consist in the abundance of the things that a person possesses. Life is much more than that. I think it's so tragic that so many people, especially in our materialistic society, don't realize that. Somebody asked me one time what I meant by materialism. You know, the Bible talks about not being materialistic. Materialistic means you know the price of everything, but the value of nothing. The price of everything, but the value of nothing. Nothing has a value. Nothing has value. Family doesn't, possessions don't, things don't. But here we find that it was then that Jesus gave these brothers, especially this one brother, a parable about a man who wasn't as rich as he thought he was. He considered the parable, and he talked about a certain rich man. A parable is an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. So the Lord's given them a story on something that they would have understood. Take a look, if you would, first of all, at the successfulness of his life. Talk about this rich man in the story, the successfulness of his life. You know, it's obvious in this parable that Jesus was describing a man who was very successful. You'll see that when we read verse 16 in just a minute. He wasn't named. We don't know what his name is. We just simply know that the Lord called him a certain rich man. So first I want you to notice the riches that he enjoyed. Notice what the Bible says about his riches in verse 16 and verse 17. It says in verse 16, "And he spake a parable unto them, saying, The ground of a certain rich man brought forth plentifully. And he thought within himself, saying, What shall I do, because I have no room where to bestow my fruits, where to store all my goods?" You see, he was a rich man with all of his wealth, anything that would bring him joy. He had probably multiple pieces of the same thing. His wealth was no doubt provided for him by his luxurious lifestyle. He probably wore the finest clothes. He had the nicest houses. Many times and probably every day, he ate the finest foods. Finest foods were stretched out on his table. Anything that he wanted was at his fingertips, and if he didn't have it, he knew exactly where to go to buy it. Now, I want you to notice verse 16 and 17. Jesus described how his riches multiplied. He spoke of a parable. The ground of this man brought forth plentifully. Constantly, he had more than he needed. It seems to me that this man had the Midas touch. All he touched turned to gold. His prosperity only increased. His wealth only multiplied. If he had been living today, no doubt Forbes magazine would have given him a cover issue to talk about all the things that he possessed. Bigger barns had to be built to accommodate his prosperity. He had to build bigger places to store it. Success seemed to follow this man everywhere he went. So the next thing we notice, not only the riches that he enjoyed, but then in verse 19, the Lord talks about the retirement that this man envisioned. Look at what he said about his retirement was going to be like. Verse 19, he said, "And I will say to my soul, Soul, thou hast much goods laid up for many years. Take thy ease, eat, drink, and be merry." So he looked around, And he thought, I've worked all these years and I've done so well for myself. I believe it's time for me just to retire and to enjoy my life. I can imagine that one of the first things he probably did was to take and book a trip to Hawaii for 4 weeks. Don't you imagine? I think that's what Roy's going to do when he retires. He's going to book a trip to Hawaii for 4 weeks. As soon as he can figure out what Christy hid all the money. Now, the fact is, I don't know what he would do, but I would imagine he was going to have a high old time when he finally retired. Now, we find here that he said, I'm just going to live it up. I'm going to take it easy. So that brings us to our second point. Not only do we see the successfulness of his life, we then see the selfishness of his life. We ought to notice that his wealth wasn't ever condemned. Nowhere in, and this is an important point, nowhere in all of this parable does God condemn him having money. His wealth is never condemned, and retirement is never condemned. The Lord's not here to tell you you should be poor or that you should never retire. That's not the purpose of this story here. Neither one of those things are indicated. No doubt he got the wealth honestly, and there was nothing wrong with him having wealth. He earned it. He deserved it. But the point of the parable is that he was a selfish and greedy man. How do I know? Well, first of all, I want you to look at the greed that was mastering his life. If you read this very carefully, I think you can see exactly why I said this greed was mastering his life. It's said of a lady named Edith. Edith lived in a little world, bound on the north and the south and the east and the west by Edith. So many times people's lives are bound by themselves. My stuff, my goods, my car, my family, we're bound by ourselves. This man's world was no larger than himself. All of his plans, all of his actions were from his own greedy, selfish desires. I'll do these things. How do I know that? If you read this and take a marker and mark this, you'll find 6 personal pronouns. I, me, 6 personal pronouns, and 5 possessive pronouns. Mine. Many times he said, this is mine, and I'm going to take my leisure. Possessive pronouns. It was what I shall do. I have no room. This will I do. And then you go through and mark the I and me and mine, and it goes on with more and more and more. So you can see why I say that greed mastered his life. Not only did he have wealth, but it appears that his wealth had him. He lived for his wealth. He lived for his things. So many times Christians do the same thing. The second thing I want you to see is that the gratitude that was missing in his life. Not only did greed master his life, but gratitude was missing in his life. There isn't one time, not one, in all of this parable that he expressed any gratitude to God for what he had. I've got so many goods, I thank the Lord for his provision. No time in all this parable. He reminds me of Jimmy Stewart. Now, you know I'm from Virginia. And the Shenandoah Valley is up there. And you remember the movie that Jimmy Stewart made called Shenandoah during the Civil War? One of the scenes that you'll remember from that movie, Jimmy Stewart was at the head of the table, the boys were all around, and the food was on the table. So Jimmy Stewart says, I'm going to pray. And this is what he said. Lord, we thank you for this food we're about to eat. But Lord, if we hadn't plowed the field, worked the ground, sowed the seed, we wouldn't have had what we've got. But we thank you anyway. That stuck with me. I run into people like that all the time. I don't have to ask God for anything, and God doesn't give me anything. I don't know why I have to say the blessing. I made the money to buy the food. So Jimmy Stewart was much the same way, and it's the attitude we see in people that are around us. The grounds of this rich man had brought forth plentifully. and yet he had no gratitude for what God had given him. Now, what do I mean by that? He looks at it as all his own doing. All of this I've got because of what I have done. And so many times we do the same thing. If God hadn't created the earth, he wouldn't have had any ground to till, would he? If God hadn't created plant life, there wouldn't have been any seeds to sow. If God hadn't sent the sun and the rain, there would never have been any crop to invest. And yet he said, I have done these things. Now, I think it's sad that we take and we take and we take from God, and yet we never stop to give God thanks. I go and I sit at a table many mornings. I did this morning with people that are leaders in churches right here in Lindale. And I'm the only one that stops to say my blessing before I eat my breakfast. I'm the only one. And I'm always encouraged when I see a little old couple sitting in a restaurant. They'll hold hands and they'll begin to pray. I'm always discouraged when I see young people that maybe are coming even from a church youth group that don't take time to thank God for the food that they've got, or the money to be able to purchase it, or the job whereby they have money to pay for the things that they've got, or the strength to be able to do the work. We don't take time to thank the Lord. So we see in the first place the successfulness of his life and the selfishness of his life, but I want you to notice also the shortness of his life. Little did this certain rich man realize that in just a few short hours, his wealth was going to belong to somebody else. I've said it before. Let me say it again. Everything you own, probably within the next 50 years, will belong to somebody else. That money that you call yours, that bank account, that car, those houses, all your toys and tools, everything you own is going to belong to somebody else. That discouraged Solomon. You remember? Solomon in Ecclesiastes was talking about how he had made all these things and built all these buildings and had all this wealth. And he said, I'm just going to turn it over to one of my kids, and they're so dumb they're just going to waste it all. I've dealt with a lot of older folks who said, I worked all my life for what I've got, and my kids don't have any value. They're just going to go out and squander it all. So many times we worry about that. Now, the fact is here we find that God comes to him with a very special message. Before this day is over, all of his plans were going to be interrupted. I'm going to build barns. I'm going to have plenty. I'm going to sit back and enjoy myself. God said, you think you know the future, but you don't know what's getting ready to happen. You see, this man had made no plans for the life after this life. He'd made no plans. He lived and he planned as if he was going to live forever. But that night, his soul was required of him. That night, he died. I want you to look at verse 20 and notice the brevity of his life. The brevity of his life in verse number 20. In verse 20, Jesus said, But God said unto him, Thou fool, this night thy soul shall be required of thee. Then whose shall those things be which thou hast provided? So he thought that he had plenty of years left. Most likely, he never had any doubt that he was going to live a little bit longer. His health was probably good. He had no doubt felt pretty good. He had no reason to think that very shortly he was going to leave all of his wealth and his plans behind. And the majority of people that I know today live never thinking that any moment they're only a heartbeat away from dying, dropping dead in a heartbeat. They know that the inevitable is coming, but they think it probably never come. Isn't that interesting? We think we've got a long time to live, only to find that our life may not be what we thought. George Bernard Shaw made a statement that I have remembered for decades. He said, the statistics on death are quite impressive. 1 out of 1 people die. One out of every one person will die. That's specific. That's impressive. Every one of you are going to die. You may die before me. I may die before you. But the reality of it is appointed unto man once to die. Unless the Lord comes back, we're all going to see death. James puts it this way. In the book of James, chapter 4, verse 14, he said, your life is like a vapor. That's a soap bubble. You see it floating along. Your life is a vapor that appeareth for a little time and then vanisheth away. It's here now. All these things are yours. Then all of a sudden, they belong to somebody else. So the only thing about death is that it's certain. And the only thing we can realize is death is certain, but when we're going to die is uncertain. You can't say to me, I'll see you Sunday, preacher, or I'll give you a call in the morning. You don't know what's going to happen, even through the night. The fact that we die is certain, but when we're going to die is uncertain. But he also reminds us about not only the brevity of life, but the priority of life. Take a look at verse 21. He talks about the priority of life. He said in verse 21, so is he that layeth up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. One of the faults of this certain rich man was that he laid up treasure for himself without no thoughts and no plans for meeting God one day in eternity. You know, the only money you're going to have when you get to heaven is what you send before you die, what you give to God's work, what you do with what God provides. You see, folks, this rich man gave no thoughts or plans to meet God in eternity. Everything but God was important to him in his life. His car was important. His family was important. His life was important. His money was important. I talked to a man right here in town, got a race car. And for the last several years, he's put all of his money into this drag race car. And so he had, I think, his first race in the past week or so, and he was so proud of it. He didn't have time to go to church. He didn't have time to serve God. He didn't have time to give to God's work. He put everything he had into his car. No thoughts about eternity. No thoughts of standing before God. The priority of life is our relationship with God. You know, there's a story that's told of a conversation between a young, ambitious fella and an old man. They were discussing the future. And the young man said, I'm going to learn a trade. And the old man said, and then? The young man said, well, I'll set up a business. The old man said, and then? Well, I'm going to make a fortune. And then? I'm going to grow old and retire and live on my money. And then? Well, I suppose that someday I'll die. There came the last stabbing question. The old man looked and said, and then? One day I'm going to die. And then what? Then what? You leave it all behind. You stand before God and you give an account for what you've done with all that He provided, whether it's your health or your financial strength or your work or your family. You're going to give all of account before God. There's a Spanish proverb that goes like this. Or it doesn't. The Spanish proverb says, there are no pockets in a shroud. There are no pockets in a shroud. We would say today, there's no U-Haul behind a hearse. No pockets in a shroud. Folks, wealth is good, and congratulations to people who are fortunate in life to be able to put together an abundance, to be able to take care of their family. But we must never forget that all that we have in this life will go no further than the grave. Everything you have in this world, all your prized possessions, all the money that you save, will not follow you past the last breath that you breathe. The greatest question in life that we can ask today is this: what kind of wealth will you have beyond the grave? We are to live and send rewards on into heaven. When you tithe, you're sending it on into heaven. When you use your time, you're sending it on into heaven. Those are the only things that you're going to have for all of eternity. So the wealth that you have beyond the grave is what you invest in the things of God. Next week, a certain man that held a party for his son. Luke chapter 15. Shall we stand?